well-known Marxist theoretician on the economy, and an activist I've known for many years. I would like to, I think it's very important that we see the international context of the meeting that we're holding today. So, Michael, can I ask you to speak to our conference, please?
Well, thank you everybody for inviting me. I hope you can hear me clearly. Sometimes there are complaints that my computer doesn't deliver the sound very well, but I'm assuming that it's okay with you guys. We haven't got a lot of time to discuss what I'm going to discuss, which is not Britain particularly, it's the world. I want you to look at the bigger picture of what's going on in the world economy, what the contradictions and issues are economically, and from that, I think we always need to look at the bigger picture in order to see what direction capitalism is going, what the contradictions are, so that we can draw a better understanding of the trends for our work in the movement. That's important because sometimes we concentrate very much on the minutiae of what's going on organisationally, but also we concentrate very much, as we are obviously in the UK, on what's happening to British capitalism. But I think we need to have a wider world picture in order to set that in context. So, as is my usual, I'm going to try and share some slides with you to help us to take that through the arguments I'm presenting. So I'm hoping that I'm able to do that. No, I'm not got a host screen sharing yet. If somebody can give me that, then I can share. Thank you. Right. Let me kick straight into the story. Hope you can see that, everybody?
Yes.
Good. Okay, so a brief discussion of the world economic crisis. Let me start, first of all, with a very simple point, that capitalism does not move in a straight line upwards, providing better and better conditions and living standards and general improvements in the life on this planet, both for the human beings and for the other species on the planet. On the contrary, it operates in a boom and slump manner, up, down, since capitalism has become the dominant mode of production, say from the early to mid 19th century. Every 8 to 10 years, we can designate a slump. What I mean by a slump is a drop in production, an output, a collapse in investment, and that means usually a sharp rise in unemployment and incomes as well. This graph shows you the peaks and troughs in the unemployment rate since 1948, only the last 70 or so years, but you can see the similar thing if you went into the latter part of the 19th century. I say this because the view of mainstream economics is that it does. If everything was left alone nicely to the capitalists to get on with it and the market economy to work, we wouldn't see these bumps. We'd have a nice straightforward line rising for growth. And in the case of unemployment, it will be flat. In this figure, it will be flat around about 2 or 3% with no ups and downs, no hills at all. And in fact, when we have the slumps, which obviously cannot be denied, also not ever anticipated by mainstream, but it's denied that it's a phenomenon that's related to capitalism. They call these shocks. In economic textbooks, if you go to universities, they talk about shocks to the economy, as though economy is riding along nicely and then some sort of asteroid hits it and blasts it to one way direction or another. This, of course, is nonsense because it's endemic to the capitalist process system of production, mode of production, that there will be booms and slumps, which briefly I will try to explain. In fact, there are recurring crises, and they're based fundamentally on the fact that capitalism is production for profit. Nothing is produced, nothing is invested in unless there's a profit that can be made by the owners of the means of capital. That's the result of what they want to do. So we only get things improving, if at all, as for society in general, if it's to the benefit of profit for the owners of the means of production, the capitalists. And if it's not, then they will stop production, they will lay off investment, they will lay off employment, and they will wait until the situation improves for profitability. A little cycle graph here, you can see everything's going nicely, but then there's profitability begins to fall as we go clockwise around this. This produces a collapse in investment and employment. They can't get the sales they had before. Often that triggers a financial collapse in the stock market and so on. Once that collapse has reached such a deep level, then profitability can then possibly rise with those who are left after the crisis and the slump has taken place. Profit returns as labour costs reduce, investment begins to rise again, and the rate of profit rises, and the speculation in the financial markets resumes. So we get this sort of circular process every 8 to 10 years, it would seem, empirically. But sometimes these 8 to 10 year slumps do not lead to a revival at the same rate of growth as before. I would argue that we've had 3 times already in the history of capitalism where we've not had just a boom and slump, a normal depression, or a recession, if you like, in the left-hand corner here, but when you have actually a depression, that the recession leads not to a return of the previous growth rates and everything goes back forward again. Of course, see that V in the top left-hand corner there? That's the loss of income, employment, and conditions for everybody. It never comes back again, but at least you return to the previous rate of growth. So a boom and slump in the normal style would take place. But in the depression, you get this position where it comes down, it comes back up, but it never returns to the same growth rate level. And we've seen that in 3 times in the history of capitalism so far. In the late 19th century, it was called the Great Depression then for about 20 years, from the 1870s through to the end of the 1880s. And then, of course, in what then became the Great Depression of the 1930s, from about 1929 up to the Second World War. In my view, if you look at the bottom right-hand corner of this graph, that's the situation we've been in, particularly since the end of the Great Recession in 2008-9. We've been in a depression of slow growth, slow investment growth, slow employment growth. We'll come to that perhaps a bit later. And above all, stagnation in real incomes and real wages for average households in the major economies around the world. This is the situation we've been in, a long depression in my view so far. So the decade of the 2010s was a lost decade for working people and for the ability of capitalism to grow. We're now into the decade of the 2020s, the third decade of the 21st century. And as far as we can see, the situation is not getting any better. We're not coming out of this depression. The situation is getting worse. Now, the argument of Marxist economics is the key behind any capitalist development is the rate of profit that is available to the capitalists that they can extract out of the working class by exploiting them and by investing in technology and machinery to try and raise the productivity of labour and therefore increase the amount of value they can get out of them. Marx argued in Capital and other places that this drive towards increased profitability has a contradiction. As all the capitalists drive to increase profitability by using labour-saving technology and so on, they actually bring about a fall in the overall profitability rate eventually over a period of time, because the value of being produced by the labour force doesn't match the increased costs that they're making, the capitalists or individual capitalists are making to invest in technology and new machinery. So there's a tendency for the rate of profit to fall. That was Marx's law of profitability, and we can see this is the top 20 economies in the world, an average rate of profit for all their capitalist businesses and so on combined in one economic figure. And you can see that since the 1950s, there has been a tendency for the rate of profit to fall. And you can see in the current period, we're actually, in my view, in this depression period where the rate of profit remains low. It's not really recovered much, even after significant slumps in at least 3 times now in the 21st century, 2001, the Great Recession of 2008-9, of course, the pandemic slump of 2020. And then there's the period that some of us have lived through, this hellhole of privatization, globalization, deregulation, closing down of trade union laws, all efforts to try and boost profitability. Capital succeeded in the major economies in the Reagan-Thatcher period, if you like, up to the end of the 20th century, and they managed to raise the profit a bit, profitability, but not dramatically, and now it's falling back again. And when we come to the slump that we just had in 2020, we can go into the question of the causes of it, but just how deep it was. There is the Great Recession of 2008-9. It was called great because the slump in the major economies, which is the orange line,
was as much as just under 4% on average for all the major advanced economies. And even the emerging economies had a bit of a slump, but not as much, because China in particular, but India as well, continued to grow. But the overall effect for the world was that we basically had stagnation, no growth at all in the year 2000, 18 months of 2008-9. But look at the pandemic slump.
The pandemic slump is way, way worse. It's much shorter, it only took a year, but you can see that the overall fall for the world, of the major economies of the world, was 3%. 3% fall
in the 2020 pandemic. And even the emerging economies slumped
into contraction territory for the first time. When we talk about the emerging economies, that's all those outside of the major imperialist economies of the north, the global south, if you like, including China and India. And you add them all together and give an average, they actually contracted in the pandemic slump. This was the biggest hit for the most number of economies ever seen in the history of capitalism. And the fall for the major economies was nearly 5% on average in those economies. So this slump we've just been through under the pandemic even beats the Great Recession. And it caused massive poverty. We already had the World Bank figures claim that we have a certain level of poverty, but their figures are ridiculous. Any reasonable estimate of poverty would say that probably about 4 billion people in the planet now containing 8 billion people are in what we would call poverty, earning less than $5 a day. That half the world's population is in that situation. But the pandemic has dramatically increased that level of poverty, particularly for the extreme poverty. That means people who can hardly survive. They're not getting enough to eat. They have no shelter on them. This is extreme poverty. And you can see the top 10 countries in the poverty count here, Nigeria particularly, 16 million more people into that extreme poverty position. And overall, an extra 50 billion, taking us up to just under 600 million people now in extreme poverty. On the other hand, the very, very, very rich have been even more enriched during the pandemic slump. This is the measure of billionaires' wealth as a percentage of GDP in different countries. Billionaires, well, anybody who's a billionaire is put into this figure, and then we look at their total wealth against the percentage of their country's GDP. So the Russian billionaires, we like to call them oligarchs. Apparently only the Russian billionaires get called oligarchs. The American billionaires don't get called. They just get called rich people who are very nice. But the oligarchs have owned nearly 25% of Russian GDP, which is the equivalent to the 25% of GDP. During the pandemic, that's jumped to more like 35%. And then the Swedish oligarchs, which nobody ever calls them that, but that's what they are, the big families in Sweden. People don't realize that social democratic Sweden is really unequal when it comes to wealth, maybe not to income, but to wealth. It's very unequal, with large amount of wealth held by a small number of billionaire families in Sweden, nearly 20% of Sweden's GDP, and that's jumped nearly to 30% of Sweden's GDP during the pandemic. And we can go down the list to the other countries. You notice that the UK doesn't have that many number of billionaires as a percentage of GDP. There's a lot of other rich people, but billionaires perhaps not so many, but everybody has increased during the pandemic if you're a billionaire. So it's been a great time, the pandemic slump, for the billionaires as a result of what we've seen during the poverty increases for the rest of us. But now the pandemic slump is over, we've had a complete change of the environment. Recovery has taken place, economies have opened up, vaccinations have taken place, people are back at work in more or less most of the businesses reopened nearly everywhere. There's still tremendous blockages on supply, of moving things around the world, transport and so on, and the lack of actually skilled workers who have not returned to work. So there's what we call supply blockages, which is the main reason for the inflation rising, not because workers have got loads of money to spend or governments have handed out a load of money, which is the argument many of mainstream economists. It's the fact that supply has been very, very weak. It was weak before the pandemic slump, and it's not recovered from the pandemic slump. So we have had a very sharp rise in average inflation of prices in the shops and for utilities and so on. Whether you can work your list down there, there's the UK around about 9% on this figure. These are not quite up to date. And in the USA about 8%. These are big rises in just 1 year we've seen in the inflation rate, as we will know. You can work down the list. So this is a big hit to an increase to the cost of living for the average household. It's driven mainly by energy prices. We've seen energy prices go wild, gas and coal and in oil, which the ability to get hold of these products has been more difficult. So there's been a dramatic increase in the prices by the owners and controllers of these prices of these companies. And this has led to a huge slump in real wages. We've never seen anything like a slump in 1 year of the average real incomes of working people in these different countries. You can work your way along the list to see here, it's just 1 year's reduction in the average compensation per employee in their with their working and so on. These are employees who are working, let alone these people who are not working. This is the hit that inflation has caused to their living standards. And there's UK's is around about 2%. I think that's an underestimate according to the latest figures I've seen. And you can work your way up the list or down the list depending on. I won't go into the reasons why Hungary's workers seem to be better off, but that's another story. But you can see on the whole, you see a dramatic reduction in living the compensation wages after inflation per employee. And it's the poorest income households who have been hit the hardest, as you might expect. This is a measure, the richest 20%, how much they've been hit by the rise in prices. That's the blue dots. And the red dots are the poorest 20% of households. And you can see virtually in most countries, the poorest 20% have been hit harder by going from left to right than the blue dot richer 10% of 20% of households. And if you go down the bottom, you just have a look at the difference between the hit to the richest 20% of British households, which is around 5%, and the hit to the poorest 20% of UK households, which is over 15% reduction in their incomes as a result of the inflation, because of course a lot of these increases in prices affect poorest people more than they do the richer parts of our community. And there are very few countries where there is no difference at all. France is quite interesting. That's basically because energy prices have been capped in France because of public ownership. And coming to energy prices, we are now heading towards the end of our price cap in the UK in April, and you can see that is going to take the cost of energy for the average household dramatically up. There's loads of people are going to enter fuel poverty from next April, and of course not just in the UK. Now I just want to take briefly, if I've got a little bit of time, to argue the case against this argument presented by the mainstream economists and governments that wage rises are the cause of inflation. If they're not the cause of inflation, if rail workers and all the other people struggling to get wages to match the rise in prices actually get their increase in wage prices, they'll simply cause another spiral of inflation, the wage price spiral. This is the argument presented by the government Bank of England, Andrew Bailey, who says, well, I'm not against people having a wage rise, but we need pay bargaining restraint, otherwise it will all get out of control, says the governor. He didn't mention, as I will point out in a moment, that if we needed restraint in profits, because that would help to reduce the effect of it getting out of control. But profits weren't mentioned. Similarly, Jace Furman. Now, he's a leading White House or ex-White House mainstream US economist who writes lots of stuff. Yeah, just read this quote carefully. When wages go up, that leads prices to go up. So if airline fuel or food ingredients go up in price, then airlines or restaurants raise their prices. Similarly, if wages for flight attendants or servers go up, then they also raise prices. This follows from basic micro and common sense. So according to Jason Furman, it's common sense. If you ask for a wage increase, you're just going to get a result of a price increase. This is just nonsense. Here is the adjusted wage share to GDP in the advanced countries for the last 40 or 50 years. Wages as a share of the amount that's being produced by these major economies has been falling as a share consistently for the last 40 or 50 years. So if wages are the cause of price rises, how come we have not seen wages rise to justify the increases in inflation that have taken place over these years at varying degrees? There is no case for that. It reminds me of the argument Karl Marx had with John Weston, who was a member of the General Council in the International Working Men's Association back in the mid-60s. He presented and said, look, said Weston, wage rises will only lead to bosses raising their prices, so inflation will only put wages back where they were in real terms.
Marx said, no, that's not true. A struggle for wages follows only after the previous struggles in prices. That's generally what happens. And there are many other things that have affected prices rather than wages. How fast production is taking place, whether there's good productivity, whether there's been an extension of money supply beyond what is necessary, various fluctuations in market prices, maybe referring here perhaps you might to energy, and different phases of industrial struggle. In fact, workers' struggle for wages usually leads to a fall in profits. That's what it does, not an increase in prices. That's why capitalists are so opposed to wage rate increases, not because they claim that it's going to cause a wage price spiral, but because they fear it will hit profits, and they will be right. And we can see that during the pandemic slump and afterwards, there's been a huge rise in the share of contribution to prices coming from profits. Corporate profits, the dark blue line, are now in the last year added 50. They contributed 54% of the increase in prices that we've seen made by the companies themselves. Raw materials added 38% during the pandemic, and labour costs, that's wage increases, added only 8% as a contribution to price rises. So if we're talking about a spiral caught in wages, it should be called the profit price spiral, not the wage price spiral. But you won't find any major economists arguing that. And we know, of course, that the energy companies are making huge profits at the moment, not only since the Russian invasion of Ukraine, but before that, energy prices, oil, gas, and coal were rocketing. And look at the size of the profits being made by these oil producers. We talk about the profits being made by the people who sell us our electricity and gas at the moment to the households. They're the retail companies, and then there's the wholesale companies. But people forget this is where the real profits are being made. Massive profits being made by the oil and energy producers, Shell, BT, Exxon, Chevron. These are astronomical, eye-watering increases in profits, and nothing is being done to extract any of the profits from this, or to control these companies, or to cap them in any way. Finally, Chair, I just want to briefly say we're now having just got out of the biggest slump in the history of capitalism in 2020, we're now about to enter another slump in 2023. The failure of capitalism to come out of this crisis effectively and deliver better production and investment and employment and incomes is going to be revealed next year. This is if you can follow the graph here, it simply shows that wherever there's a blue arrow, that implies a contraction of output. In other words, these economies listed up and down here, if they go into a blue arrow, that means they're now slumping. So you can see the euro area in the fourth quarter of this year, according to this forecast, and this is a general forecast by a number of economists, will be into a slump territory right through the next first half of 2023. In my opinion, it'll be longer. Germany, France, Italy. The UK is broken a good record. It's actually started a slump before anybody else. And you can see that it's also going to produce an even better record, but its slump is going to last all the way through 2023 and probably beyond, according to the latest figures provided by the Bank of England and the Office of Budget Responsibility. But even if we get down the list, we can see the US is going to be, at least by the second half, according to this forecast, will be in a slump as well, and other major economies. So the world is going back into another slump next year, having just 3 years from the last one. Now, this means further hits to real wages, to the possibilities of employment. Unemployment appears to be low in many countries in the advanced north. This is a bit of a nonsense because the sort of employment that people are getting is precarious, short-term, temporary, low paid, etc. But as we go into the next year, we are going to see a significant rise in unemployment rates in the US, in Europe, and also in the UK. For the first time, figures much higher than we have seen, at least since the Great Recession. And why is this slump taking place? I'll finish on this, Chair. There are 2 points. That first of all, if profits is the nature of this economy, then profits are beginning to decline. You can see on the right-hand side of this scale, they're already headed down to 5%. This is out of date. We're actually down into negative territory now. This is for the major economies in the world, my working out of the global profits change in the corporate sector. And you can see in the pandemic slump and how deep it was, and the Great Recession as well, we're now heading into negative territory. So that's the key factor which is driving the slump next year. And the other factor is a huge rise in debt. If you look at the left-hand graph here, you can see that business debt to GDP since 1870 is now at its highest level ever in the history of capitalists. So capitalists have taken out so much debt in order to keep going that they're now got a massive amount of debt that they have to keep servicing and repaying. Interest rates have been incredibly low, so that most companies have been able to afford this comfortably and use this cheap debt to speculate in the stock market and the bond market. But if you see the right-hand graph now, you can see the rise in the cost of debt is coming through very sharply. This is just the government debt market in the US, but it's every debt market. It's heading up higher, back to the Great Recession levels or even higher. So the cost of servicing this debt is rising because central banks are raising interest rates. And there's about 20% of companies on average in Europe and the US who have got so much debt and make so little profit that they can't even service that debt now, let alone before interest rates have started to rise. They just carry on by getting more debt in order to survive. So we call them zombie companies. They're undead of capitalism. They don't make much profit. They employ a small number of people. They don't invest and improve their technology or anything, their productivity. They just survive by taking out more debt. And that's 20%. So when you read about huge profits from the energy companies, or Microsoft, or Amazon, or Google, don't be fooled. That's a tiny minority of the huge swathe of companies in the North and the global North. And the majority of them are facing low profitability, and the minority, 20%, actually basically bust, and will certainly be bust as we go into this slump next year. The contradictions of the 21st century are expressed, of course, in this crises that we get on a regular basis: falling profitability, the long depression I've talked about, poverty and inequality. But of course, any discussion amongst socialists must look at the other major contradictions in the 21st century, which I'm not dealing with today. The environment, a huge hit to the climate, which is leading to global temperatures way above anything that the Paris commitment has made as we go into the rest of this decade. Probably further pandemics, because those pandemics weren't products of some shock charts. They were a product of the rapacious drive into remote areas by industrial farming and exploration and urbanization, and the general degradation of nature that goes on because of capitalist production, with no consideration for the impact it has on the rest of the planet. That is an environmental crisis which is becoming not just an irritation, it's becoming a fundamental disaster for humanity in the next 2 decades. It has to be dealt with. There can be no way of avoiding it without leading to the disaster of perhaps ending up in the Stone Age. And then there's the geopolitical contradiction. Because of lower profitability, because of these slumps, increasing rivalry, because of the fear of US imperialism that is losing its hegemonic position in world capitalism, we see rivalry developing, trade and technology battles, the war, as we see in Ukraine and Russia, but also the really impending danger of a major confrontation between the US and the rising economic power of China, both in trade and technology. Already the process of trying to surround China and curb it and contain it has begun. Will it move to even more dangerous levels of military conflict? The fundamental contradiction behind all these three contradictions, of course, is that we have capitalism production for profit and for value and not for social need. We need to replace this system as an urgent necessity. It generates crises because it's a system of profit rather than social need. And profitability falls, so we get the continual crisis, one after the other. A regular recurring slumps, rising inequality of wealth, destruction of the climate, and more wars and conflicts. It's a failed system of human social organization and must be replaced. We must organize for the public ownership of financing key industries globally to be controlled and run democratic and collective as part of a plan to meet humanity and the nature's needs over the next generation. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed. I think all of our brains have had a workout listening to that. So thank you very much. Can I ask for any questions? Nick.
Yeah, just to say, it's really complicated and people don't really read around economics because the books are really dry and very hard for people to access. Could you recommend a couple of books that are easy to access and would help people understand things better?
Any further questions? I'm not sure. Craig, have you got your hand up? Let's see. I've got to scan and see.
Sorry, I'm about to put it up. Sorry, I can't find
it. Craig, go on.
Okay, if I can go. I just want to ask a very simple question. Thank you, Michael. That was a really interesting presentation. And actually, I was going to ask, are you going to be able to share those slides with us? Can we?
Yeah, I'm just going to put them up on the chat now for you guys.
All right.
That may be.
That'll be really useful, Michael. Thanks.
Yeah. Yeah. I should have that ready shortly. There we go.
Steve.
Michael, I think that's an excellent analysis. I'm pleased you're putting up the slides and everything. I just want to focus on one thing, which is the uneven development of capitalism. Mm-hmm. Right, so that, and you illustrated in your slides that some countries are doing worse than others for whatever reason that is. And they're the ones, I think, that because of that unevenness, they're the ones that are most likely to have deeper crises of their political systems, the possibility of revolutions happening as a response to those things. And you did highlight the fact that the UK was performing in one of those where you had one of your arrows, you had a long arrow, and the UK was doing worse than everybody else, right? Which makes complete sense to me, because we are sitting here, we all feel that anyway. And I think that's got implications for what we're doing here in the UK. The fact is that we are probably the sickest. They used to call it the sick man. I don't know why man, but anyway. But sick man of Europe used to be, well, one thing with Turkey used to be the sick man of Europe. Russia used to be the sick man of Europe.
Then it was Italy, and now it's
yeah. Well, exactly. So we've got all those different things going on, and I think therefore that is an important thing if we're understanding. I mean, it's not contradicting anything you've said. It's just to try to highlight that one point, that in terms of a perspective, what are the weak links in the chain, as it were, of capitalism? Where is it most likely there will be a kind of major crisis, unsolvable crisis, that requires the socialists in that country to really think through their politics very, very clearly, because they might be in the front line of something or other. And I think you highlighted the UK is one of those possible places where we can see that happening. That's it. Thank you.
Thank you. Dave Landau?
Yes, just a quick question really, which is to do with, you know, the mini budget that happened a few weeks ago and the chaos that then followed on the markets. Clearly there was trust represented one group set of interests, and the current set of interests are sort of in dominant now. But what were those? How does that reflect those contradictions? Is there a way of explaining that conflict and how they made such a mess of it? Yeah.
Any further questions before I ask Michael to sum up? Michael, we thank you very, very much for your contribution. I think it's been, fantastic. And can I say one thing, that there's one of those slides that I'm in conversation with some people involved in the refinery workers disputes. And there's a couple of those slides that are going to be dynamite if we can get them across to those workers to prove, how much money these people they're striking against are making. So that would be really good. But can you answer the questions briefly, please?
Yeah, of course. It's I realise that this sort of discussion could take a very long time, so it's not difficult to do everything properly. Just on first of all, the trust question. Well, I think what we saw there was, at least it relates to the question that was raised about Britain being the weakest of the major economic powers now, and the most liable to political splits amongst the ruling class, that we have the ludicrous position that the ruling class is totally split in the UK. Or to be more exact, the City of London and big business doesn't control the Tory party anymore. That's the problem it's got. The Tory party is run, or its membership, who are people of my age, and hopefully of even less ability to speak. These people who live in the shires and God knows where else, a small number of them, have the most weirdest ideas, and they seem to have the idea that all we need to do is to keep the workers down, have a market economy that's completely open and exploded, deregulate everything. The line of trusts and the people that she got to as her advisors, the Institute of Economic Affairs, who are lunatic libertarian economic school that believe in total free market, complete contempt for working people, and also contempt for big business. So this is a sort of semi-libertarian, semi-fascist idea. These people who advise trusts thought they could just spend money like water. And for those who believe in modern monetary theory, bear that in mind. They could spend money and nothing would happen. They would just be able to deregulate the economy with industrial zones and all the rest of it. This wasn't acceptable to the City of London. This was frightening because they saw that their assets, their stocks, their bonds, and other assets for which they rely on the kindness of strangers, as Mark Carney used to put it in the Bank of England, namely foreigners, to invest in the UK. The UK has a huge trade deficit. If it doesn't get investment in some form, portfolio investment, foreign direct investment and so on, then the pound just plummets. And it started to plummet, and the value of the bonds which the City of London was holding started to rise dramatically. Something had to be done. This government had to be got rid of. And that's why we saw the power eventually being used by the major controllers of capitalist system in Britain, the City of London big business, operating to change at the top the leadership of the Tory party. Of course, they're still left with the membership of the Tory party. It remains to see whether the new regime, which has gone back to the old days of the Great Recession, of austerity and other measures, which they plan for us as soon as the election's over. They're holding them all back before they hit us with like a cricket bat, or a baseball bat in American terms, with the austerity program after 2024. So I see the loss of the trust position as a result of a setback for the libertarian, lunatic, crazy wing of the Tory party membership, and the re-establishment to some extent of the City of London in control of the party. On the other questions, uneven combined development, I agree that that's the point of this discussion. You must look at the world economy to see what the trends are, because then you get a better idea of where crises are likely to appear and how they would also be reacting politically. At the moment, we see wherever a crisis takes place, on the whole, not entirely, certainly not in Latin America, which has been a big swing to the left and to parties that at least represent or say they represent working people. But in Northern Europe and Southern Europe, we see a swing to the right as a result of the crisis. So we see the development of a semi-fascist party being in government in Italy and having positions in various other governments as well in Northern Europe. That's because so far the response to this crisis has not been reflected in a movement of the left sufficiently to change things. But it's not impossible. I just have to say, just remember the last results of the French elections, which we often forget about. The left did pretty well in that French election from nowhere. Yes, they're not got the presidency. Yes, but they have stopped the government having a majority. Macron does have a majority in the parliament. All these things are signs of where it could go either way when it comes to the political front. What books to read to understand all this? Well, if only we had one nice little book we could follow. There are lots of stuff online of various sorts. Depends what you want to know about, whether you want to know about the existing economy and what's happening, whether you want to understand the theory behind it, the theory behind the capitalist production and the economy. There are lots of books like that. I've written a few myself. Marx 200, you might want to have a look at. That looks at what Marx
is relevant, whether his ideas are relevant to the 21st century, which obviously I think they do. It's a little book, it's not very long to read. It's perhaps a little bit more than just a simple, straightforward 5 or 6 points. But yes, I think it's a difficult question to answer. Ben Fine, somebody says in the chat, I agree. Ben Fine has got some useful stuff as well. So there's lots of other people who write a lot of good stuff too. I try in my blog to deal with all these issues in a way which you guys in the active movement like myself can understand and use. That's the point of the blog. It may not be a book, but it's a blog which tries to deal with the events as they're happening, and also for explaining them and to answer the arguments of the capitalists and the mainstream economists as well. Other people do that as well. But we do need one book, and I see somebody says I should put my book titles on there. Looks as though somebody's done it for me. So you've got that to look at after this conference. Thank you.